Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate that introduction, and I am delighted to be here, and of course, very pleased that Bruce and Kate chose to pass out the book that I did last year with my colleague Kristen Goss. So let me just say 30 seconds about the book. It's not exactly a commercial since you have it already, and not asking you to buy it, but it is co-authored by my colleague Kristen Goss, who's a political scientist. I'm an economist. She covered the public opinion, politics, movement stuff, and then I covered the stuff like what is a gun, and what do we know about gun violence, and what difference do different kinds of gun control make. It is written in the form of 107 questions and answers. It is not meant to be read from cover to cover in case you were so inclined, but rather more to be treated like a box of chocolates where you kind of dip in and pick a question that is on your mind and go ahead and nibble at that. We did what we could to make it objective, to characterize not only what we know, but also what the debate is and where the disagreements are. And at the end, then we have references for each chapter that should be helpful without actually using footnotes. So that's something that I hope that you'll find useful. It was certainly written partly with a journalist audience in mind as a reference book, and I hope it serves that purpose. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 30 minutes and then open it up. And I have a particular agenda. It may turn out to be too long depending on how fast I talk. But let me just show you what it is. And that is, this is the central question. What should be included in a discussion of the costs of gun violence? And so that Garen gave you a presentation partly about the public health perspective and the burden associated with the deaths that result from gun violence. And what I'd like to do is to expand that discussion and to talk more generally about the different kinds of burdens, not just the public health burden that's associated with gun violence. Why is it ultimately that we think of this as a serious problem worthy of our time, worthy of the attention that is being paid to it? Just a question to have in mind as you see what I have to say about that is think about your own community and your own life and how does gun violence affect it? And I think the answer to that question would include of the people that perhaps you've known who have been lost to gun violence, but I think it would also come up with some other ideas as well. The second question that is what distinguishes gun violence from other kinds of violence, and in fact, for the most part, in the first part, I'm going to be talking about all kinds of violence. But I do want to say, why do we care about guns in particular as opposed to violence with other types of weapons? And then the third issue is just to take on the question about whether gun violence is closely connected to guns, or whether the people who commit gun violence are in a category of their own, disconnected from the rest of society. And of course my answer is that there is no disconnect. And finally, the question that comes up many times when I make a presentation on the costs issue is, Cook, why are you this gun grabber, only talking about costs and not benefits? And so in the last section, I'll talk about the benefits of gun ownership and not the benefits of gun violence, particularly. Okay. Here's a graph that I think serves as context in a variety of ways, and you saw some of it from what Garen was putting on, but it really deserves more attention. I mean, it is one of the great stories of our time, and that is the crime drop. and particularly the drop in violence rates that peaked in the early 1990s and are now, to an extraordinary extent, the homicide rate, the robbery rate, the assault rate, everything that we measure in the way of violence has dropped enormously during that time. I'm going to have to use this pointer. So here's the national homicide rate. You can see it peaking back there in 1993. It drops, and it goes from 10 per 100,000 down to below 5 per 100,000. And so the homicide rate today is half what it was at the peak of the crack era. And what this kind of peak of graphs up here that lines up there is about particular cities and what has happened there. You can see, for example, the blue line is describing the New York miracle, where they went from 30 per 100,000 down to a rate that is actually dipping below the national average, below 5. The city has been transformed, and then you see Los Angeles, which did almost as well, and Chicago. So these are huge changes in the quality of life, or so it would seem, in those cities. It's not something that if you ask the public in a public opinion poll, they necessarily have noticed, but really they've noticed, and how they conduct their day-to-day lives in many neighborhoods that were formerly terribly impacted by violence has changed dramatically, and a lot of other things have changed too in ways that I'll want to talk about. So keep that in mind, that we are living in an extraordinary time given the last 50 years of the history of violence. We're back to where it was in the Eisenhower era, is what it amounts to. And that's quite a story. The second thing that I want to say, though, is this is by no means the whole story if what we're talking about is the social burden or the social costs of violence. Because what it is showing us is only the story about victims. And the victim story is only one part of what we want to talk about when we want to have a comprehensive accounting of how violence affects us. So what should be included? If you had read the Mother Jones piece, Mother Jones is doing this amazing job at covering guns. They've done some of the best work on rampage shootings in their data work there. And then recently they made a big investment, and that Garen mentioned, in updating the cost story and came up with now the $229 billion per year is what. And if you look at what they're doing there, it is using what's called the cost of illness method that does focus on victims, and it turns out the great bulk of the costs that they come up with is to basically multiply the number of victims by $6 million. And the $6 million comes out of a number that is used often in traffic safety or the environment, something like that, about the value of a human life on some kind of average basis. So it's not adapted particularly to the circumstances of violence as opposed to some of the other causes of death or risk. And in a variety of ways that I've written about with Jens Ludwig in our book, Gun Violence, the Real Costs, I would say is inappropriate. So I was conceptually completely opposed to what they were doing, and we had long arguments about it with the reporters. I will not bore you with that right now, but I'm just saying this is a controversial approach. Economists would say it's wrong, that even though it's very familiar in the public health context. Of course, they did include the costs of the public response to crime, the investigation, case processing, prison, not to mention the medical costs that are. No disagreement about that, but that's a very small part of the total. That's around $8 billion of the 229 along the way. And then they missed what I think of it as some of the most important parts of the costs of gun violence. And that is all the costs that are associated with the fact that all of the time, all of us are anticipating the possibility of becoming victims of violence and taking steps to minimize that risk or to reduce that risk to ourselves and to people in our family and to people that we care about. And those prevention activities and avoidance activities and the fear and the worry that remain nonetheless, of course, differ depending on where you live and all the rest of it, but it turns out that collectively are very important and should not be ignored. But one analogy that we give in the book on the costs of gun violence is polio that was very prominent when I was a child. And you know, the costs of polio at the time were being, again, the medical costs and the costs of lost lives, the costs of lost productivity of people that were paralyzed. But those analyses typically ignored what, again, seemed to be the most pervasive cost, and that is that parents around the country were worried every summer that their kid was going to get polio and taking extraordinary measures to try to reduce that risk. And none of that kind of community effect and individual effect was included in that very narrow accounting. I want to bring it back into the conversation, and I would say that in some ways it's the most important feature of gun violence. So let me talk further about the disconnect between observed victimization and cost. And just four very small examples. One is protecting the president. Thank God none of our presidents have been shot since 1981 when Reagan was shot and almost killed. So by one accounting you could say no victims, no cost, right? But of course there's a huge cost. The Secret Service, bless their hearts as we say in the South, they're not doing that great, but they are so far 100% successful in protecting you know, the president since then. And they do it at the cost of billions and billions of dollars. So that's not something that you can ignore if you're saying what are the costs of gun violence, because of course all of the presidents that have been attacked with guns in our history. You have the recluse problem that criminologists have scratched their heads and said, you know, the people in inner cities that are often report being most concerned about crime are not to be too offensive, but the little old ladies. So it's the little old lady problem, and yet they have very low victimization rates. So they must be profoundly misled about their true risk. The fact is, they're recluse. They lock themselves in their apartments. The reason that they are not victims, if they live in a high crime neighborhood, is because they don't expose themselves. Is there no cost associated? Well, their life is transformed by violence and greatly impoverished. And it has real value associated with it, but does not show up in the victimization results. When we were doing an article for the Future of Children, a good journal worth paying attention to, one thing that we were talking about was the interviews with parents that break your heart about how, you know, 4 o'clock they'll say, I get worried that the gang members will come out and my kid is going to get hit by a stray bullet. And so that I bring them inside, and then, you know, on really bad weekends, I'll have them sleep in the bathtub because the metal in the bathtub will stop the bullets. And again, very low observed victimization rates, but very high costs. Or my conversation with Mayor Ed Rendell, I remember when he first became mayor of Philadelphia. And he said, you know, the thing that really kept him awake at night was that at some point there was going to be a murder in the commercial district in downtown Philadelphia. And all of those suburbanites that were finally coming into town to eat at the restaurants and to patronize those places would stop coming because it would be a headline story and that would be it. They would destroy an enormous amount of business activity and that would be the end of it. So that, again, not victimization, but something else is going on. Safety is what we're talking about. It's a commodity. It doesn't necessarily show up in the form of victimization statistics. And safety is the freedom from the threat, and it has the same value. as other amenities that might be part of a neighborhood. I have a list here, but probably the list missed the most important thing, I realize, and that's the quality of local schools, for example, at least where I come from in Chapel Hill, that's huge. And these values of clean air and attractive surroundings and quiet and safety are subjective. But they're very important, and they push a lot of economic resources, and they certainly push the quality of life, and so should not be ignored. Okay. So here are some of the indicators about the resources that are being pushed. One is population. So if you look what was happening, or you look at Detroit today, the first question you'd have is, where are all the people? You know, Detroit has 700,000 people living there now. It had over 2 million a while ago. Where'd they go? Or if you look at New York, it was losing population, and then the miracle happened, and now they're gaining population. Part of the story is violent crime, and the people who can leave in the face, they leave their neighborhood, they leave the city, and it's a pretty good indicator of what's happening. We did an estimate with help from Steve Levitt that every murder in the neighborhood gets about 70 people to move out. It's a net figure. If you're familiar with the experiment that was recently the lead story in the New York Times called Moving to Opportunity, where they recruited people in 5 cities living in housing projects and gave them the option to sign up for a voucher that would then support their moving to a low crime area. And the women, all women, were asked, why are you signing up? Why are you interested in being part of the experiment and getting out of the project that you're living in? And you can think of lots of reasons about why they would say, you know, about all of those amenities that I just listed, or access to jobs and schools and all the rest of it. But the number one reason was violence. That's what they were concerned with more than anything else. They were concerned for themselves, they were concerned for their children. So moving is one thing. Property values, obviously, are making a big difference. And business activity that's related to it, and then economic growth and development. You know, it was interesting, again, looking at the Times, they had an advertising insert the other day from the nation of Colombia. Basically what the Colombian government wanted to get across by this rather expensive move was to the business investors in the US that Colombia was now safe enough to be considered as a place for their, I mean, physically safe, free enough from violence. Closer to home, you have Camden, New Jersey, you know, who became infamous for being the most violent city in the country in 2012. They are not going to regain any of the businesses and factories that they've lost until they can solve that problem. And so violence then becomes a huge drag on economic development. Detroit has to solve that problem to bounce back. What we did back in 2000 in trying to address this and try to get at these subjective values and monetize them, put in monetary value, was a willingness to pay study. It's common enough in environmental circles. It had never been done before with crime or violence. And what Jens Ludwig and I did was to ask a nationally representative sample of people how much they would pay to have gun violence reduced 30% in their communities, and then use that as kind of a measure of the social costs along the way. Other people have tried to use changes in property values and other kind of indicators along the way. There's nothing that's perfect. Everything has real difficulties associated with it. But these difficult measurement exercises at least had the virtue of getting right at what I think is the real issue. And that is that as a prospective matter, the costs of violence are all about safety. They're all about this commodity of safety, and that may or may not be closely connected to actual victims, is what it must be. Right? Is that? Okay. So that's topic A. How am I doing? Topic B is, I've been talking about violence generally. Everything I said would have applied to all kinds of violence. But the reason we're here is to talk about gun violence, and I think that that is entirely appropriate. And the reason is that the type of weapon that's used is not just an incidental detail of a criminal encounter, say a robbery or an assault, but it really has a profound effect on the outcome of what happens there. It actually has a number of effects on the outcome, but the one that probably matters the most is that because guns kill quickly at a distance, they don't require much skill or strength, or even intentionality that they make killing easy, and the result is, to borrow a public health term, they increase the case fatality rate. They increase the chance that in that assault, in that robbery, somebody's going to die. The effect in gun versus knife, just based on the kind of Wiscar's data that Garen mentioned, and a survey that we have of emergency rooms from the CDC, that knife attacks that injure enough to send somebody to the ER can be compared with gun attacks that are serious enough to send somebody to the ER. The gun attacks are 12 times as likely to kill the victim. And there's a variety of other kind of comparisons that you can do along these same lines, but trying to standardize for the circumstances and the intent and all the rest of it, it's simply much more likely that a gun is going to kill. Frank Zimmering, who is the very first social scientist to do research on guns in a systematic way, and he's still with us, very much with us along the way, wrote a book in 1997 called Crime is Not the Problem, that took that idea, instrumentality idea, the idea that of the lethality, intrinsic lethality of guns, and blew it up and said, you know, U.S. has a terrible reputation internationally of being a super violent country. If we look carefully at the statistics, our robbery rates and assault rates are not that much higher than countries we like to compare ourselves, Canada, Australia, Britain, Europe, and so forth. Where we really stand out, without a doubt, is homicide. And the reason we have such a high homicide rate, first and foremost, is we have a different weaponry. And so when our assaults and robberies are much more likely to involve guns and hence to kill. So that's where the American exceptionalism should be focused in any kind of conversation. It's not that the US is such a terribly violent country, but it's that we're such a lethal country. All right. Illustrating the power of the gun, you know, they like to use a phrase, no drive-by knifings or stray fists. You know, part of it is kind of the randomness that is associated with it. Certainly, we have rampage shootings. We don't have rampage knifings. Ironically, at the same time as the Newtown massacre that killed 20 school children and 6 educators, there was an attack in China, in the mainland China, that killed involved about the same number of victims, but none of them died. And that attack was with a knife rather than with a gun, and so that serves to illustrate the point. Certainly, the gun provides the ability to attack well-defended victims. All of the assassinations that we've had, political assassinations, have been with guns. And so that this is the slogan that I would offer you that comes out of this kind of analysis, that guns don't kill people. People kill people is the old bumper strip. I would say guns don't kill people. They just make it real easy. And whenever you make something easier, it happens more often. That's what it comes down to. Part C. How is gun violence related to the general ownership and availability of guns? A topic I've been working on since the 1970s. Still haven't quite got it right, but the thing that we know about this comes from surveys of prisoners and from accounts of the surveys of the public, and comparing the two. What is really seen over and over again is that criminals do not get their guns the same way as the American public in general does. They shop in a different market, is what it comes down to. The criminals are getting it from their social network or from street sources. By and large, 20% or fewer are actually buying guns from a gun store. And that would be the number, for example, that comes out of the last representative survey of prisoners that we have in this country. We're about to get a new version of that survey along the way. So less than 20%, whereas a majority of people, non-criminals, get their guns from gun stores if that's what they're going to do. So it's a different situation, and that because they're getting it from their social network or they're getting it from street sources, they're really getting guns that are diverted from legitimate commerce. That's from what is by and large legal ownership. Somehow those guns end up, whether it's by theft or whether it's through some other kind of transaction, make their way into this more underground economy, and that's where they end up. So it makes a lot of sense that in a city or a community where there are lots of guns, it's going to be easier for the criminals to get guns than it is, say, in Boston or New York, where there are actually very few guns along the way. And sure enough, that's an area that I've researched, comparing, for example, the percentage of homes that have a gun in a city with the percentage of robberies that are committed with the gun. That kind of analysis makes it clear that the robbers are not a distinct group. In fact, they're closely tied to the local ecology in terms of where they get their guns, whether they're likely to have them, and that kind of thing. So it is the general pattern of gun ownership that is influencing, to a large extent, the ownership or the use of guns in crime. I'm not talking about suicide. Garen did a great job of doing that, but let me just point out that is also true for suicide, that the general prevalence of gun ownership is very closely related to the likelihood that the gun will be used in a suicide. So we heard about John Lott already, and just to nail this point down, let me say that not everybody agrees that more guns are going to produce more gun violence. In fact, John Lott has become a wealthy man by writing a book called More Guns, Less Crime. That's in its third edition now. I think I had heard it was the bestseller of all time from the University of Chicago Press. It's not because it's easy reading. I don't know if any, I mean, it's full of regression results and all kinds of technical stuff. And it's not internally consistent. It's murky the way only economists can be murky. But it has been hugely successful, and the slogan has entered the public consciousness and the public mind. And triggered the, so to speak, the formation of an expert panel of the National Academy of Sciences, which then took the data that Lott had used principally in his early work on this subject and redid it, replicated it, did the thing you're supposed to do in the scientific method, which is all about replication by peers, as Bruce was saying. And found that the case was not made, that we couldn't conclude, as Lott had concluded, that in particular, that if we eased carrying restrictions and had more guns on the street, that would reduce crime, that the evidence wasn't there. Since then, an economist that I would highly recommend to you named John Donahue has continued to work on this and has various versions of it. So there's some actually very high quality work that is being done on this subject. The other thing is that the evidence that says that a high rate of gun ownership by no means produces a safe environment. And in fact, the reverse is true. My own work, starting in the 1970s, has found over and over again that where there are more guns, there are going to be more gun assaults and more murders. And then actually that the burglary rate also is positively affected by the prevalence of guns. Why because guns are worth a lot in the black market. And so that somebody, in deciding whether to break into a house and is performing like an economic man, will then judge the profitability of that. It'll be more profitable if that house has guns in it than if it doesn't have guns in it, because they're easily fenced at high value along the way. But that, anyway, there is direct evidence on both of those that's the direction the story goes, and I would say that that's as good as we have on that side. Okay. My fourth and final topic, and that is the question about what about the benefits? So we're talking about the costs. What about the benefits? And I have seemed to there are no benefits. What are we going to do?
We'll give Ariel a quick look at the machinery while you keep vamping.
Well, I don't. Okay, I mean,
Give the talk.
So here's what I would say about benefit. Thank you. The first thing to be said about it is, as an economist, I have to believe in consumer sovereignty. You sign a statement before they give you your PhD. Then, yes, I believe in the marketplace. I believe that people know what they're doing. And 25%, and actually, I think, Garen, your figures and mine are very similar. 25% of the adult public has chosen to spend some of their hard-earned cash on guns. And the latest statistics coming out of Harvard is 7 guns per gun owner. So we're going to see more of that survey, which was just finished soon. But Matt Miller at Harvard gave us a sneak peek the other day, and he said people who like guns really like guns, and they have a lot of them. And so obviously they're producing a kind of value. So that value may be subjective and personal, but so is the value of art or the value of many other things that we respect, and so that we should respect this as well. That's not a big leap for me. And we can talk about all of the different uses, about hunting and target shooting, collecting, about simply tinkering with this fascinating machinery, and that all of that is absolutely reasonable and true. And then there's this other thing, which is that most people who own guns believe that having a gun actually makes them safer. And makes their household safer, and that's another benefit that's associated with it. Now that's more tricky for an economist or anybody else to evaluate, because it's probably dead wrong. And it may be true for some people, but not overall, and it is a bit problematic. But in any case, it's there as an experience benefit for being a gun ownership, and it has now been dignified as the basis of our new Second Amendment right, which was decreed by the Heller decision in 1998. So that's or 2008. So there's a third possibility in terms of the benefit, which is that people who carry guns and people who keep guns in their home are providing a public service. And so that it's not only that they're enjoying their use and may or may not be offering protection for their immediate family, but they also are discouraging crime and maybe even discouraging tyranny by their private possession of guns. And I think that's where I would disagree, and most social scientists would disagree on that last issue, that's misguided. But that's not to say that guns and gun ownership don't have value. I'm a gun owner, and I think that my gun provides a bit of value to our household, and I really don't do well with this thing. You can see I shouldn't be trusted with technology of any kind. We're gonna, so then, I mean, that raises the question, all right, so guns have both benefits and costs. What else is new? Lots of products have both benefits and costs, or benefits and risks associated with them. What can we do about that? And the answer is that in thinking about different regulations or different laws that might be govern the distribution and use of guns, we would want to take both into account. Certainly that has been done in the area of highway safety. Driving has become enormously safer during my lifetime, enormously. I mean, we have far fewer fatalities per year than we did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, despite the fact that the amount of driving has increased hugely during that period of time. And so it's not that we have outlawed cars or outlawed driving, but we've found ways to compromise in terms of people's liberty in buying exactly the kind of car they want and driving just how they want to, and maybe most directly whether they can drive without wearing a seatbelt or not, and found a way through the thicket of freedom and risk versus the benefits of transportation to a place that I think most people are feeling pretty comfortable with in that area. The bottom line will not be earth-shaking, especially coming from an economist, but that in evaluating any kind of particular measure that we might be considering about in the gun domain, that it makes sense that you actually compare the change in costs and the change in benefits before making a decision, and recognize that there might be action on both sides of that ledger before you reach a final decision. So let me open it up and give you your turn. Yes?
Could you address the benefits of just gun production in this country? The industry itself and the economic benefits.
Yeah, and actually, I would look over at Garen for a more precise understanding of that. But the first thing to be said is I think that the gun industry, in terms of manufacturing, import, distribution, is small. It's about at the same order, I think we said in the book, as ice cream in terms of the contribution to gross national product. And so lots of people say, boy, the gun industry is so powerful politically, and it must be very rich, but it's not really the industry that's so powerful. It's the NRA that is that powerful. There's a second thing to be said, and that is the gun industry is contributing, and not to be snarky about it, but not only to our economy through production and distribution, but also through medical care costs. And so that the emergency rooms in downtown Atlanta and places like that are certainly doing more business because there are so many guns around. And the coroners certainly are making out well, and the undertakers and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of economic consequences to the death and destruction that are associated with guns, and as there is to the production side and to hunting and shooting. And here's the truth of it, that if we found a way to reduce gun violence that included the possibility of reducing the size of the gun industry, and I'm not saying that's the only way by any means, that the resources that are currently going into that and the employment that are associated with that would then, through the wonders of the marketplace, be transferred to other activities as the public found other things to do with their time and their money. The same issue has come up in another topic I study is alcohol control. And people say, well, how can we cut down on drinking because so many people are making a living off of alcohol? And the answer is, they'll do something else. That's how the market works. Yes?
You mentioned the comparison between the auto industry, the car driving and gun ownership, and that deaths and accidents have been declining over the last 50 years. And I guess it was about 50, maybe it's this year, 50 years ago, Ralph Nader put out that unsafe at any speed. And so the auto industry was really after him right at first, and then of course everything is fine and cars are more safe and roads are more safe and people are more safe and medical costs are down. Is there such a thing, or could there be such a thing for guns or the gun industry as some kind of effort like that, like what he has done, what has happened with the cars?
I think if I'm feeling very optimistic, I would talk about smart guns as maybe some kind of analogy to the safety that has been engineered into vehicles. So there is a possibility that someday it will be possible to buy a gun that is personalized to the rightful owner. And there is a gun of that sort now being manufactured by an outfit called Armatix in Germany, but it's not available for sale in the US. But the Obama administration and the military and others are interested in this, and maybe we'll begin to see it. If it does become generally available for different types of guns, then there's a variety of results that may be hoped for under that regime that would push in the direction of a safer environment. Because it would cut down on transfers within the household. It would cut down that are unauthorized. The teenage son finding the gun, taking it to school, or using it to commit suicide, for example, or the thief who breaks in and takes the gun and then puts it into the underground market in circulation along the way. So the hope is that at least in some small way, there's a case where technology can matter and would really make a difference along the way. Yes?
One more, maybe.
Have you looked at the economic costs and benefits of concealed carry? Because obviously a lot of businesses differ on whether they let people, not concealed carry, open carry, sorry, or you can bring a gun to a restaurant or whatever. I know there's been movements where people, because they can, they've taken really large guns into restaurants and public places, and they're like, oh, well, everyone will feel safer knowing that we have a gun. And I looked through and I saw that you have a section here about what people think about whether guns make us feel more safe as a society and we see them. But you looked at
Yeah, and it's a moving target in that area. The answer is no. I haven't looked at that. I'm not aware that anybody has along the way. I think that there's a general principle that continues to be true, and that is that people feel more comfortable with their own guns and their own gun carrying than they do with their neighbors. So that I'm sure a lot of restaurant patrons would be worried if they saw that some of the other patrons were carrying a gun, and maybe some of them would feel safer. It's a really interesting question, which obviously has become more and more salient as that phenomenon is increased.
Phil, I have a question for both you and Darren, since you're both here. We use as the marker that we've been using all morning is homicide. Homicide and suicide, death by firearm. But there have been a lot of advances in emergency medicine and medical technology, either from a public health standpoint or an economic standpoint. Are they driving down numbers? Are they affecting your analysis at all? What's the interplay there?
The answer is no. We think, and Phil and I are laughing right now because we spent the half hour before the conference talking about a study that we're hoping to do of that. So more too simple to be believable science. We have easily available crummy data on emergency department visits. We have much better data on deaths. And there's a study that was widely and uncritically reported upon that concluded that changes in medical care were responsible for the decline in homicide. Failed the plausibility test. Those of us who do that work know that there have been no changes in medical care that could have accounted possibly for the effect that they saw. So we're going to try and do something better, and over to you.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say is that the only time series that seems to be supporting that is coming from the CDC's survey of emergency departments, which does show some growth in the number of people who are coming to the ER with a gunshot injury, at the same time that the number of deaths is going down. And so that seems to show that this trend in case fatality that you would say maybe is the result of improved medical technology. What makes it so hard to believe this series from the CDC is that it doesn't square with anything else we know about what's going on with gun violence. So if you look at the FBI's crime data, for example, it's certainly true that the assault rates are following the homicide rates. The robbery rates are following the robbery rates. The same thing from the victimization survey.
Okay. And one last closeout question for you. Again, if I'm looking at my own state or region as a reporter, and I'm trying to do a kind of cost-benefit analysis of a particular proposal to restrict carry or to restrict gun ownership, key markers I should be looking at, if I'm looking at statewide or regional data, would be?
Well, I think it's important to, to know that any kind of analysis like that will involve lots of uncertainty. But that's not unique to the gun area, right? Most of the public policy making we do is in a fog of uncertainty about what the consequences of that new curriculum in elementary school is actually going to accomplish, or whatever the deal is, right? So that's the first thing, that you're not going to have a precise answer on these issues. The second thing is, the reason we regulate to the extent that we do, or the reason we consider deregulation, is because of thoughts of public safety. And that is on one side of the ledger and certainly deserves a great deal of attention, but it's not the whole story. We would also like to know, what costs are we talking about? And some of the costs are going to be to the consumers, the people who buy guns and to enjoy guns, and I think that deserves respectful attention in terms of how much that's going to impose on them in a variety of ways. And it's not just a political matter. I think it's also a matter of good government, that we should care about that. So that's the balancing.
Okay. Well, thank you. This was great.
Yeah.